Because in the States, if you create financial success, it's almost a given that you share it, and you're almost a social pariah if you don't. Now, that conversation would never happen in Australia. We've got a fair way to go to flip that conversation so that in the next decade, you sell your business, 100 million people say, yeah, right, Joe, what are you going to do with it? And the Taylor Swift tour, lots of commentary around, well, she's made, and I don't know whether it's right or not, but she's made $1 billion very quickly from this tour. What's she going to do with it? That commentary was in the States. Again, Midnight Oil have $1 billion tour, which they should. They're very good, Joe. No one's going to say, what are they going to do with $1 billion?
Hello and welcome to the It's Never About Money community. Today I'm very excited to be in studio. We have a very special guest, Peter Winneke, the author of Give While You Live. I've been busy looking through the book and looking at previous podcasts that Peter's been on. Peter's a generosity and life legacy advisor with over 20 years of experience in strategic, impactful giving. He has established more than 100 philanthropic family foundations, making a significant mark on the sector. And in this particular book, Give While You Live, Peter shines a light on best practice giving and provides a constructive critique of the philanthropic sector and Australia's giving culture. He offers a guide on how we can significantly improve practices within the sector with the ultimate aim of achieving more and better giving. Peter's career is pretty impressive, being the inaugural CEO of one of Australia's largest grant-making family foundations. He has also served with the Meyer Family Foundation, the Sydney Meyer Fund, the Catherine Freeman Foundation, Philanthropy Australia, and the Reichstein Foundation.
That's right, Joe.
Yep. So this conversation also coincides with the development of a special report that I've been working on as well, to help families get more involved in charity. Welcome, Peter. I'm looking forward to asking you a few questions.
Oh, it's great to be here, Joe, and thanks for taking interest in such an important area.
So let's start with why you started in philanthropy, why you work in philanthropy. You say in your book that in your 20s, you wanted to devote yourself, you realized that you wanted to devote yourself more to the community, but you weren't really sure why that was the case.
Yeah, look, I was sort of drifting through life, Joe. I'm not from a high net worth family, but had a reasonably privileged upbringing, had two sets of grandparents with strong values who did a lot of work in the community. I had a good education. My parents did work for the community. As a young fella, I'm watching that. I mean, when I can remember when I was about 10, my mother's mother, so my grandmother, we'd go around to visit her as a little tacker, and she'd be sitting in front of a microphone like we are, reading from these large, voluminous, dry legal texts so they could be recorded so that vision-impaired students could study law. And I'm looking at that. I'm not overanalyzing that as a 10-year-old, but I'm sort of looking at it thinking, wow, as a little kid, I'm thinking that's really boring. That's interesting that she does that. And I think it's sort of years later when I fell into commerce. I had 16 years in the commercial world, 8 years in solvency and 8 years of acquisitions at a listed media company. Sort of enjoyed all of that, but it provided enough purpose for me. And I think at that point, Joe, I'm sort of reflecting on as I grew up some of the issues that influenced me, and I was thinking about issues such as watching my grandmother and her service to the community.
Do you think at that point when you're watching a grandmother at such a young age, it's presenting a lot of questions that you don't have answers to?
Absolutely.
But those questions stay, don't they?
They're in the back of the mind, Joe, without question, in the back of the mind. And I didn't look at that as a 10, 12-year-old and think, oh, that's what I should do, because it looked really boring. But I could see the service to the community. And she was an old lady, and she got polio at a young age, so she had a caliper on her leg her whole life, never complained about anything. I mean, she had an amazing life. But it's just it's in the back of the mind, it's stuck there. And then years later, I didn't get married until late, so I didn't have any dependents. So for years I would just go backpacking get out of the Melbourne winter. And I did the Europes and the Americas straight after uni. And then after that, I was travelling to low to middle income countries, not to save the world, just to get off the beaten track and a bit of adventure. And I'm seeing inequality around the world. And as I'm getting old and reflecting on, and after each trip, I would go back to my reasonably well-paid corporate role, thinking I need a bit more purpose in my life. And I was seeing examples of impact that philanthropy could have on the growing inequality around the world.
Yeah, it's so interesting as well that in your family you talk in your book about your grandfathers. Both grandfathers had knighthoods for community service, and yet you also say in your book that in your 20s you weren't sure exactly why that you wanted to go to it. And it seems to me abundantly apparent that there is leadership. There's a degree of family lineage to draw back on.
Yeah,
there.
And as a kid, I remember it in my final couple of years of school and at university. I was sort of a shy kid just growing up, and I didn't really. I mean, everyone knew about my father's father because I had the same surname, but people didn't know who my mother's father was, and I sort of didn't tell people because I felt a bit awkward at the fact that both grandfathers had a knighthood, and I don't know, as a young kid, it was sort of sitting strangely with me. And it wasn't until later in life I was I read more about the family history on both sides of the family. Mum's side of the family, my great grandfather was a Scottish Presbyterian missionary trying to convert cannibals in the New Hebrides, which is now Vanuatu. So,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't be alive. He should have been. Well, he should have been eaten a few times, literally.
Yeah, wow.
And he wasn't, thankfully. So that's why I'm here.
Amazing. And, you talk about your travels and can you share some insights about traveling to these sort of low to, middle income countries and whether your views on sort of equity and justice have changed as a result of those? Yeah,
well, I was sort of wandering through. This is every year. I'm very privileged, Joe, to be able to do it, but I would go for about a month. It was sort of the longest period of time I could get leave for in the middle of the year. And I would go to, whether it be Central America or South America or the Caribbean, Africa on another trip, the Himalayas, and just seeing the inequality everywhere. And the thing that really, and so you'd meet some really interesting people. You'd meet some amazing people. I particularly remember a 2-week hike through Nepal and the Annapurna region. I mean, the most stunning place in the world, but also the most beautiful people who in Western eyes had nothing. And they're living in a shack in the mountains. Now, the view out the window was incredible. It was of the Annapurna range, incredible. But they didn't have all the toys that Westerners would have. But they were amongst the happiest people I came across. So that sort of sits in the brain as well. I mean, what are we doing in the Western world? Why do we have so many worries? And I say these people have very few worries. So again, those sorts of issues were sort of mulling around in my brain for a number of years.
So it kind of maybe came back that having finite resources and not just chasing the money for the sake of itself.
Yeah, well, at the time, that trip, Joe, was towards the end of my commercial career, and I was working for a listed media company, and it had about 4,000 or 5,000 shareholders, and you could look through the shareholder list, and big names, wealthy names, and I was sort of reflecting. My role is to create wealth for wealthy people, and that it just wasn't. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but for me, it wasn't the path that I wanted to continue on down. So that's when I started. And I'd been mulling over these issues for a number of years, and I'm thinking, gee, there's a lot of pontificating going on here, Peter. There's not a lot of action. So I started researching if I left the corporate world and moved into the for-purpose space. It didn't, and at the time I was reading Anita Roddick, the founder of The Body Shop, and this is the late 90s, writing about business can be a force for good. And I'm reading this thinking as, probably my late 20s, early 30s I've never read that before. That's interesting. And then I'm thinking, I've developed these commercial skills over the last 15, 16 years. Let's not throw them away. Let's try and how can I use those in an organisation with more purpose? So that's when I started researching various charities that perhaps I could work with. And then I stumbled into the philanthropic sector. And so this is the late 90s. The philanthropic sector in Australia is not large now.
No, it's not.
22 years ago, it was tiny. And frankly, 22 years ago, it was a bunch of Jewish families in Australia. And if you took them out, there was very little left.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
There were very few foundations with a balance sheet large enough to employ staff. So it was tiny. And then I'm researching the sector here, UK, US, Canada. And I'm particularly the US, where they've had this strong culture of giving for generations. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, well, actually, we sort of copy a lot of what the Americans do, rightly or wrongly, eventually. They've built this, for a variety of reasons, this strong culture of giving.
Is it a strong culture of giving, or is it actually just a function of the extraordinary wealth?
Yeah, it's a bit of both, Joe. I mean, it's a larger country than Australia. They've had generations of wealth. Let's just throw in a few generalisations here. The Americans are good at celebrating. They're better at celebrating success than we are. They're comfortable to stand up in a room and saying, "Oh, I'm doing well." Whereas Australians, and also in the States, when they're leaving the East and going out to the Wild West, and they wanted to build a city hall, they didn't run back to the East and say to the government, "You need to come and help us build a city hall." They just built it themselves. There's almost a disdain, and there still is, I think, for governments getting involved in their lives. Of course, we come from more of the British. I mean, they had a sort of British formation as well, but we're more of that traditional British system of higher taxes, higher safety net. The tall poppy syndrome is alive and well in Australia, and I wish we need to get a young PhD student to do some research on the tall poppy syndrome. Why is that so much alive and well in Australia? Is it part of our insecurity? If we do well, we build people up, but then hang on, they're getting too big for their boots. Let's bring them down a few pegs. That has an impact on if someone wants to give here, that has an impact. They might give, but they might do it quietly because they think they might be called out for giving for the wrong reasons.
It's interesting to explore whether it's cultural, as you make some good points, or whether it's actually structural as well, with respect to the way our system works and the way our government is involved in helping us harness our collective power.
It's definitely a bit of each. Definitely structural. I mean, our taxes over the years have been traditionally higher than the States, and so people have thought, well, I pay my taxes. And in the States, a lot of states, not all of them, some of them still have death duties, so that encourages people to set up foundations and give through that. We had them here, but they were Queensland abolished them with the Joh Bjelke-Petersen government, and then everyone else copied, so people wouldn't move to Queensland. And then if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, it was hard. I mean, private ancillary funds were set up in 2001, so that's about 23 years ago. Before that, it was not easy to set up a family foundation and do it in a tax-effective way. The introduction of private ancillary funds, and they had a different name, but in 2001, it's the same vehicle.
Same vehicle, yeah.
Yeah. That's changed. That made it easy. And there have been a number of other structural changes. So some people in Australia keep calling for structural change. It's not. There's been a lot of terrific structural change. It's cultural change that we need. It's role models.
Interesting. So kind of segue into nature versus nurture in terms of why do people give? And, part of me says that it's ingrained in our biological nature. I mean, there's an altruism center that lights up when there's someone has had a problem in front of you, and you have the urge to want to help someone.
Yeah,
I do in part think it's that, but then there is then obviously the environmental aspect and the cultural and the nurture aspect. So could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I think
what you think.
It's there's a lot of evidence, Joe, that says that if you commence giving at a younger age, you give more when you're older. So we need to do a lot more work in primary schools and with families. I write about this in my book. When we're not a family with significant wealth at all, far from it. But my wife and I have got two now teenage boys. When they were little, we started giving them pocket money, and they were getting $3 a week. I think it's higher than that now.
Inflation.
And this is pre-pandemic, of course. We had coins, so they were getting. We had the money box that called the Moon Jar money box, which has 3 slots. So it's like my oldest boy, who's now first year uni. When he was about 5, we started the pocket money. I gave him 3 $1 coins, and he knew that he had to put $1 in each slot. So he picks up the first coin, goes straight into the spend slot. Picks up the second coin, just a little bit slower, but puts it into the save slot.
Yeah, the marshmallow test.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes. Picks up the third coin, and I'm not making this up. It's literally hovering over the share slot, and he withdraws his hand. He looks up at me and says, "Dad, this is mine. Why should I share it?" And I was thinking,
good question.
It's a great question from a 5-year-old. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking as I answered it, yeah, this is what a lot of my 60-year-old clients say. It's mine. Why should I share it? But so if we can teach kids at a young age to share and the satisfaction that comes from that, no doubt they'll give more when they're older. And so there are lots of ways to get kids engaged. I mean, and so that's one thing we did with our kids. There are organisations like Kids in Philanthropy. We can get kids out volunteering at a young age. Carefully.
Actually, we're having Maya Marcus. I've actually had a recording with her as well.
Terrific.
So that'll be on the podcast as well.
They do some great stuff.
Some amazing stuff. Yeah.
There's lots of ways to get the kids engaged, and that sort of starts the journey.
So, going to, the inception of creating the book. What's the story behind it? Why did you want to write a book like that? And why the title?
Well, the title, Chuck Feeney is an Irish-American who's not well known in Australia. He and a few mates discovered duty-free shopping in the 1970s, and Chuck made about $8 billion and then gave it all away. He was sort of the role model for Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. He was sort of their figurehead, really. He really inspired them to do more. Initially, Chuck was anonymous. He was just a sort of a private guy and just thought, well, this is just something I want to do. I don't need all this wealth. How much is enough? How much the kids need, which we'll come to shortly, Joe. He thought, no, I'm going to give it away. And then, as he said, he had some colleagues who said, look, Chuck, it's amazing what you're doing. If you told your story publicly, you're going to inspire more people to share their wealth. And then, as Chuck said, he became synonymous with anonymous. Large gifts were being made anonymously, and people thought, well, that's Chuck and his foundation, Atlantic Philanthropies. So Chuck talked about giving while living. And, the title of my book I attribute to Chuck, Give While You Live. Chuck talked about if you've created surplus wealth, why would you leave the fun of sharing that and giving it away to someone else when you're gone? Get on with it. Do the giving while you're living. So he inspired a lot of people. And I've had a terrific sort of 22 years working in the philanthropic sector, worked with some amazing families, worked with some really smart people, seen a lot of failures in the philanthropic sector, a lot of successes. And I just thought I should share that. And what sort of tipped me over the edge in terms of, because I thought, do I really want to write a book? And then I thought, actually, I've got so many really interesting stories. I wish I'd read this book or something similar 20 years ago when I joined the sector. It would have just fast-tracked a lot of my learnings in terms of these conversations around how much is enough, how much the kids need, what is best practice giving. And so where I landed, Joe, I thought, actually, if I write this book and if only 10 families read it and act on it and think about a more constructive use of their wealth, and also, because I'm quite optimistic the philanthropic sector is going to grow dramatically in the next couple of decades, I was also hopeful that if 10 young people read the book and then get inspired to use their brains for good, for purpose, and join the philanthropic sector and help it become a really strong sector. So I thought, well, if that's the worst case scenario, that's pretty good. So let's write it.
I resonate so much with that. I mean, the idea of the podcast is very much similar. I never intended it to be anything more than an ability to help people understand concepts about money and meaning. And if, like you, if only a few people did, and I was able to help in that way, it's pretty profound.
Yeah. Well, that's
So
right.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Looking at your book and, going through some of the sections, I couldn't help but notice how comprehensively you address some of the questions that I've been thinking about as well with respect to, dealing with families who want to start
Yeah.
giving. And
Yeah.
there's a few things that seem to keep coming up, and I thought we might be able to address them because I know that your book does.
Yeah. Well, that's terrific. It's been helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. So just in terms of the question of, do we have enough? This idea, right? So this is a roadblock or an obstacle.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
So how do we balance that need for financial security with like having that life meaning, that meaning that comes from doing in the community, giving in the community?
Yeah. It's there often seems to be with high net worth families, we don't quite have enough, so we've got to be careful with how much we share.
Charity starts at home.
Yeah, I've heard that many times from very wealthy families.
Yes.
Now, Joe, there's been talk of recession for a couple of years. So, hang on, the markets, there's going to be a downturn. The markets have been running for quite a while. There's going to be a downturn. I need to be careful. I've got to be careful about the 50 million being turned into 46 and a half. What I've found, Joe, is that when families actually think seriously about how much is enough, and a couple of families I've sat down with, they've actually sat down with the Excel spreadsheet and worked out, well, what do we need? Our lifestyle is we own our home, we own our holiday home, we've got a holiday home, we've got a boat, or maybe we want to buy a bigger boat. Let's buy that. We want to pay for the kids' secondary and tertiary education. Got ageing parents, so let's just slot a contingency in there for looking after them. We might want to go to Europe every year for a month. Let's slot that in, and then let's put in a contingency. And then they actually see how much they need. I'm obviously talking about high net worth families who have got surplus. And then usually, Joe, there's a surprise of what the surplus is, usually with high net worth families. And then usually the letting go becomes a bit easier, and they think, we've got a sub fund or we've got a private ancillary fund, but it's a low percentage of our family wealth, and we're possibly not being as generous as we could because we worked out how much is enough, and it's X. In one family I worked with, they worked out they needed X, and they had $1 million X, and they had a few children, and they thought, because part of this equation is how much do the kids need, and this family was thinking, well, this is going to ruin the kids. So let's put the bulk into the foundation and get on with it. And let's do something constructive with this wealth that we've created, which we never thought we'd have, and we don't need it because we've worked out we need X, and we've got way more than X.
So one of the questions we ask in our first meetings is, to what extent would a gift become destructive in your child's life? And I notice in the book you talk about self-esteem as related to achievements, not inheritances.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, we get our self-esteem from our achievements. From we go through life. We might study, we might work, we might fail. Hopefully, we might succeed. We've got to work hard, and that's how we build our self-esteem, from our achievements. And I've seen cases where significant wealth being passed down the line is managed well, but I've seen a lot more cases where it hasn't been managed well. And you can see.
Can you explain the Trustafarians examples?
Someone gave me that term a decade ago.
Which I quite liked.
I thought it was a ripper.
It's a ripper. It explains it nicely too.
Well, I know a number of families where the third generation, they don't often work. Yep. They're sitting on investment committees, the family office investment committee. And now often, not always, often those people are doing some terrific work in the community because they can.
They've got the time and energy and resources.
They've got the time, Joe. That's right. Yep. And it's terrific. The gurus who know more about this than I say that the issue with often, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, it's often because the first, when I say first generation, I'm talking about the wealth creators. They often start with nothing, and they're working their butt off, and they're building and they're building a business, and they're creating wealth. The second generation then usually work with them. So they're seeing the values on a daily basis and the work ethic on a daily basis. then the third generation doesn't necessarily see that, and often they don't learn to work, and that's where problems start to arise. If you've got a generation that hasn't learnt to work, I don't know how that's going to end well. It might end well, but more often than not, it doesn't end well.
So interesting, because in one of my previous podcasts, I sat down with Matt Heiner from Net Wealth.
Yeah.
And Michael, his father, and him work together for many years now.
Yeah.
He talked about the passing of the education of innovation and being a business owner is very highly rated and important in their family. I really love that episode for a number of reasons, but that was really a massive learning.
Yeah.
The inheritance, as the family expands, is not going to keep pace.
No.
But the innovation and the education does help the family continue to grow.
And part of that's going to come if you're learning to work.
Correct.
If you're not learning to work, how is that going to come? And I mean, you've probably heard of the classic Warren Buffett saying about this issue of leaving money to your wealth. Leave enough to your kids to do anything in life, but not enough to do nothing.
Yeah.
Classic Buffett. It's wise, it's concise, not enough to do nothing. And that's when you've got enough to do nothing, that's when you don't need to learn to work. I mean, we've got 2 teenage boys, and my wife and I, we think, we've tried to instill strong values in them, and we don't have significant wealth, as I said before, but we've had the red wine conversation, my wife and I. If we won Tesla and we've got 50 million, how much do we leave the boys each? And it's not 25, because then you don't need to get out of bed in the morning. You can just invest that and pretty good return. So, it's a tricky area. There's no right and wrong answer, but I'm seeing more families as we've created this staggering wealth in this country in the last 3 to 4 decades, more families giving more serious thought to this. I mean, where I landed was, and we know there's, as I said, there's no right and wrong answer. Where I landed was, if we were a high net worth family, we would leave our kids a small house each. That comes back to the Warren Buffett. Leave enough to do anything in life, so they've got no rent and no mortgage, but they need to get out of bed in the morning to put food in the fridge. It's pretty easy to mount the argument, oh, that's too much, a small house. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't given a small house. I don't know about you, Joe, but so you could, we could spend the next hour debating whether that's too much, and you could easily argue it is. But if you're a high net worth family, and then at the same time you give them a small house when they need it, when they're perhaps late 20s, early 30s, when they're building careers, building families, and then say that's it. There's nothing more coming, because I've seen many cases where in high net worth families, the kids are, they're waiting for the parents to pass away.
It seems to me that the most important thing, regardless of whether you're high net worth or not, is the ability to be able to impart sense of self-sustainability in the next generation. The ability to, again, innovate. Make a good life for themselves.
Build resilience. I mean, as a parent, I think that's the number one thing you try and instill in your kids: resilience. Life is a roller coaster, and when the highs are great, but when you're on the lows, how can you get through that? If you've got resilience, you can. If you've learnt to work, you can.
So we've been lucky enough to be able to determine that we're self-sustaining. I've got enough surplus to maybe give, so that roadblock is out. The next question is, where do we give? And there's challenges both from a family looking at the, over 60,000 odd charities or whatever that they can choose from. And then charities trying to actually appeal to the values of the family. So what are the obstacles here in the where to give question?
I think the first thing, Joe, I suggest to families, because again, there's no right and way of doing these things, but in my couple of decades of experience, is bring the kids along for the journey. And if the grandchildren are old enough, get them engaged too. It's something we don't sort of enough about, we don't emphasise enough, is the incredible educational tool the Family Foundation can be for the next generation. There are heaps of learnings, whether the family's got a sub-fund, a public ancillary fund sub-fund with $20,000 in it, or it's got a private ancillary fund with $5 million, it's finite resources. So the kids are learning about investment strategies. You bring people like you and your brother in to, work with the family. How do you work out the investment strategy? that's a great conversation for kids. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Never had that chat before. So you've locked that away. That's good. Hopefully there's a discussion around impact investing in that conversation as well. And then it's, well, what are we going to do with this vehicle? I mean, a family foundation it's a microcosm of a business. Just happens to be in the business of grant making and possibly impact investing for social good. So there's, again, a lot of learnings for the kids. What's the vision? What's the mission for the foundation? Whether the board meetings are held informally around the kitchen table, as I've done that many times with families, or whether they're held in the family boardroom. It's a board meeting. There are minutes taken. There are accountability. So lots of governance learnings, implementing the giving strategy, and then trying to measure the impacts. There's lots of learnings for the kids. And then I would say, coming back directly to your question, Joe, most families I see do what I call the spray and pray. They're spraying money out to 5 or 6 different focus areas. There might be a bit to the arts, a bit to climate change, a bit to early childhood development, and maybe First Nations Australians. I recommend to people, I sit down with people, I help them determine what are you guys as a collective unit, what are you passionate about? Ideally they should be operating in places that they're passionate about. And ideally, Joe, that's just 1 or 2 areas, whether it be early childhood development or climate change, whatever it is, just pick 2 areas and then do some research, build up some expertise yourself or with the help of others in those 2 areas. And then work out either yourself or with the help of others, who's doing the best work in that space, who's got the strongest plan, the strongest executive team and board, and how are they measuring their impact? That's what I suggest to families, because you're right, there are 60,000 charities in Australia, which is ridiculous. If we were starting again today, we're not going to say, right, let's get 60,000 charities for a country of 26, 27 million people.
I have a hard enough time at a restaurant trying to pick a meal, to be honest.
Well, it's crazy. It's crazy. Let's do the next podcast on how do we consolidate the charitable sector, but that's
a whole nother
difficult issue.
Yeah, and I mean, as a sort of small deviation, thinking about, we've kind of selected a charity. How do we measure their impact?
Yeah.
And this kind of heart versus head scenario where charities tend to be led very much or promote the impact by stories and anecdotes, which are great, but also a lot of very successful people are very much driven by the quantitative data. And every family is very different in terms of what they want to see.
Yeah.
So you talk to us about how, what's best practice giving and, how can we make an impact?
Well, best practice is terrific that you've asked that question, because the philanthropic sector in Australia is not great at measuring impact. Firstly, not measuring impact of their charitable partners.
Yep.
And then secondly, terrible at measuring their own impact. Mm-hmm. So even if they're doing the first bit well, Joe, you're a charity, come and show me what success look like, how you're measuring impact. But they really then shine the light on themselves and how are we going? We've been running this foundation for 5 years. Have we had any impact? So I think it's sort of horses for courses. I think we need a lot more work done in this space in the philanthropic sector. I think a simplistic approach, a simple way to go about it is, once you've worked out your focus areas, then it's determining who's doing the best work in that space and how are they measuring their impact. I think sometimes donors create a lot of work for charities. They might be making only a modest gift, but they're saying, here's our gift, but we want a 30-page report on how that's going. But if it's a $10,000 gift, they shouldn't be providing a separate 30-page report, because that's poor use of their resources.
Yep.
What I'd be suggesting to families is, once you've worked out a really strong organisation with a strong board, executive team and a strong business plan, how do they measure their impact? What's success look like for them? How are they going to get there? What are the milestones along the way, so you can see whether they're still on track to achieving success? And then don't ask for a separate acquittal report for yourself, because that's creating work for their 30, 40, 50 different acquittal reports for their donors. Just ask, how are you showing your board? How are you showing your board that you're measuring impact? And if you're doing that on a twice monthly basis or a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, whatever it is, share those same reports with us so that we're not creating work for you.
And then you're making your judgments based upon that as if you're an extended part of the board.
Exactly. So it's less work for the charity, because most charities in Australia are undercapitalised. So that's provide less work for them. And then if you're not happy with the way the measurement is, you can either move on to another organisation or provide them some funding. You can see that they've got a terrific team in place. We love their plan. They don't quite know how to measure it all, but then provide some funding so that somebody can come in and help them measure their impact more effectively.
Family might not have the time or the inclination or the skills to be able to interpret the data. It might be that there's just another advisor that's coming in to actually discuss the outcomes.
That's right.
As well.
And a lot of families won't have that time, Joe, unless they've got a larger foundation with a couple of staff members.
Yep. You talk about that you believe that there's enough wealth and intelligence to solve every problem.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense when you think about the collective power of all the private sector families out there that could potentially buddy up and solve major issues.
Absolutely.
You talk about a pond example as well in your book.
Yeah, that's the Peter Singer example.
Example, yeah.
We see something in front of us. If we see a toddler struggling in a pond of water, of course we're going to charge. We just bought our new, this is the Peter Singer example, which I quote in my book. We've just bought our new R.M. Williams boots, but if we charge, we don't have time to take them off. We've got to charge into that pond and pull the child out. Well, everyone does that. But then kids are dying overseas all the time, and we manage to look the other way because it's not front of mind. And so Peter Singer, who's obviously very black and white on these issues, he calls that out and saying, well, we shouldn't be looking the other way. We should be trying harder. And as I do write about, we've created throughout the world, we've created, and including in Australia, this staggering wealth in the last 3 or 4 decades. We do have the wealth and intelligence to solve every issue if we can be inspired to do so. The Productivity Commission said a few years ago, the intergenerational wealth transfer in Australia alone in the 2 decades, $3.5 trillion. JB Weir said a few months ago in a report, actually that's an old number, it's probably $5 trillion now. So if we got just 10% of that, just 10%, that's 500, and allocated that to charitable trusts, that'd be 500 billion, but that could distribute 25 billion to our community each year. That's just 10%. So, and that's not going to solve all our problems, but that's just 10%. The AFR Rich List, the top 200 families, aggregate wealth of 625 billion. That's just the top 200.
I want to pick you up on a comment you made. You made a comment about our community. I think it's important to define that because I think your definition of community can be quite different. We talked previously about our next door neighbours are a lot of problems overseas, not just domestically. And so often we have quite a domestic focus when it comes to.
Yeah, we do, Joe. So firstly, we don't have a strong culture of giving, and then when we do give, it's primarily within Australia. And I think that's a bit of the immaturity of the sector.
Yep.
Families who are starting to give, perhaps rightly, and I'm not surprised we haven't built a strong culture of giving. I'm optimistic that we will, but most of the wealth's been created in the last 3 to 4 decades only.
Yep.
So I'm not surprised we don't have a strong culture as they do in places like the States. We will get there. But me and others, and me via my book, I'm just trying to fast track it a bit. And so when families do start giving, they tend to give within a 2 or 3 hours of flying or driving to the organisation, so they can touch and feel and see the impact that they're having. And maybe that's fine, certainly in the early doors. But we know we've got growing inequality in Australia. We've got issues around, lots of issues we face. But of course, there are far bigger issues that are faced offshore. I think as our generosity grows, as we build that stronger culture of giving, I think a far greater percentage of our giving will go offshore. And we should be starting with our neighbours in the Pacific.
Yep, makes sense. So the idea of to structure or not as well. So when I think about structure, I'm talking about having an entity created potentially for the purpose of long-term giving, which enforces a kind of giving, whereas obviously a non-structured approach would be just donating ad hoc. So I'm sure there are circumstances where donating ad hoc is absolutely appropriate, and it's not necessary to have a structured scenario, but could you maybe explain the differences?
Yeah, you're right, Joe. You don't necessarily need a structure to give. You can just get on with it.
Yeah.
Particularly if you've just got one or two organisations that you want to give to. If you're giving to one organisation, I know someone who gives significantly to Guide Dog Victoria, for example. They don't need a structure because they're really just writing large cheques to the guide dogs. That's fine. In my experience, Joe, where there's a family involved and where there's a structure, the structure tends to bring more strategy. So firstly, if you've got a family and you're just writing cheques or EFTs now,
yes.
Stop saying writing cheques.
I like it, to be honest.
My
it's
mother,
very nostalgic.
My mother still writes the old cheque, but where there's a structure, where you're giving, where you're just writing the cheques, that tends to be late at night on your own.
Yes.
And maybe there's been some thinking and some strategy around that, or maybe not.
Yes.
But if there's a structure and you want to get your kids involved, then you're going to set meetings at times that suit the kids. You're not just going to set meetings late at night when the kids might be off at footy or cricket training. You're going to set it at times which suit everybody. That's the first thing. So you're getting the kids engaged. You're having a family meeting to talk about philanthropy. It might only be an hour every quarter, but it's a dedicated meeting. It's not to talk about the family investments or the family business. It's to talk about the giving. So it provides some space to talk about the giving and the giving strategy and what are we going to do here and how are we going to get the kids engaged. So
is this the teachable moments as well that you talk about?
Absolutely,
in the book? These are the teachable moments, yeah.
My poor boys, teachable moments every hour of the day. Oh, it's not another teachable moment as a dad. There are teachable moments everywhere for kids, and that's the way to teach them. But as I said, in my experience, if there's a structure, work out what's the right structure for your family. But it just brings more strategy, which will most likely, Joe, result in maximising your impact. That's why I said, and if you're giving, I think there's an obligation to maximise impact, and I don't always see that in the philanthropic sector. I think I see a lot of families who have brought incredible focus and discipline and work ethic to building a family business and creating wealth. And then they take their business hat off and they put their giving hat on, and often that just drifts out the window. That's always staggered me. Really intelligent people, why are they not bringing that same discipline and focus to their giving? Fascinating. Because that's the way that you'll maximise your impact. Again, it's easy to give money away. You just write your cheques. But if you want to maximise your impact, need a bit of a strategy and bring it some thought.
So on that, there seems to be a need for a person to sort of giving in a kind of quite casual way or not reflective way. Is there I feel like the drive has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
So you talk about the book that you read, Dare to Matter.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that what you're talking about is someone along the journey realizing that it's not all about me.
Yeah.
And I get a lot of benefit from this altruism.
Yeah.
And the ability to look after others.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about what that book, Dare to Matter, actually did for you?
Yeah. It was written by a guy called Jordan, and I've just forgotten his surname, which is good.
Yeah, it's a funny name too.
I got it. Castillo with a K.
Yes, that's it.
So very briefly, he was an optometrist, followed his father into the business.
Yes.
In I think it was New York. Not really finding enough purpose in it, and he went away on a trip, a camping trip with a few mates, and they climbed this mountain, and he was sort of grappling with life, and he's sort of yelling out to the world, I need to dare to matter. I want to matter in this world. And so he went back to New York and built this incredible charity, this for-purpose business, Vision Spring, which is providing really cheap eye care to those in low to middle income countries. So he's using the skills that he developed But his challenge to himself was to dare to matter. And in his book, he wrote this incredible book a few years ago called Dare to Matter, which I talk about in my book because I thought it was so well written. Um, Imagine if most of us dared to matter. Those that are privileged in a privileged position to be able to do that. Again, it comes back to we've got the wealth and intelligence to solve every issue. And if more of us dare to matter, how am I going to matter in the world? And I guess, going back to your question earlier, Joe, why did I write the book? I'll probably listen to this later and think, gee, that was arrogant. But I'm trying to dare to matter in the philanthropic landscape.
Makes sense.
How can we encourage more families with surplus wealth think about a more constructive use of their wealth and to emphasise, as we talked about earlier, the incredible educational tool the Family Foundation can be for the next generation. Great learnings. You've got to have one of these. The learnings are unbelievable. The teachable moments are everywhere.
Mm. Somehow, thinking about this idea of almost like self-actualization, getting to a point where you've been able to recognise that you can look after yourselves in so many ways.
Yeah.
But now it's about looking after others and thinking about others. Not, can everybody just, drop their own need for looking after themselves and dealing with their own survival and then thinking about others? Or is it like, are we in a fortunate position that we can even have this conversation in this beautiful podcast studio as an example, talking about these concepts, because we don't have to worry about some of the things that maybe others do are less fortunate.
And I'm very conscious of that, Joe. And again, I think we've mentioned a couple of times, and we're really talking about high net worth families with surplus, because there are plenty of families who don't have any surplus, and
that's right.
They've got the opposite of a surplus right now, and they're struggling,
especially with inflation and all the rest of it
and
going on at the
struggling
moment.
to pay the mortgage and the interest. But we're talking about high net worth families, and there's stats out there that the old Credit Suisse, which I think is UBS now, not sure. They say that there are 58,000 families in Australia with investable wealth of $10 million, and said to me, we don't have the exact stat, but so there's probably 20,000 plus families in Australia with net investable wealth of 20 million and above. So that's excluding their primary residence. So we've got a lot of families with surplus. I think it comes back to, we touched on this earlier, it's why do we not have more families sharing their surplus? I think it's role models. We don't. So Steve Jobs, the Apple founder, passed away a decade ago. I think this is a really interesting story. So he passed away 10 years ago. Lots of discussion right around the world. What a freak! He changed the world. Not sure he's a nice guy, but he's a freak. He changed the world. We've all got these Apple products. Then in the States, they had a serious conversation around, but hang on a minute, that's great. But what did Steve Jobs? He created significant financial wealth for his family. What did he share any of that? And I gather he didn't. So they marked him down.
Yeah, right.
Well, actually, he didn't share any of his success with the community. Because in the States, if you create financial success, it's almost a given that you share it, and you're almost a social pariah if you don't. Now, that conversation would never happen in Australia. I mean, if you sell your business with your brother tomorrow for $100 million and share none of it,
no one would even know.
Nobody would care. They'd say, well, Joe and James, gee, they're successful. They built that business and they sold it for $100 million. That's unbelievable. Be no commentary on what you did with it. So we've got a fair way to go to flip that conversation so that in the next decade you sell your business for $100 million. People say, yeah, right, Joe, what are you going to do with it? And the Taylor Swift tour, earlier in the year.
Yeah, I think it was this year.
Lots of commentary around, well, she's made, and I don't know whether it's right or not, but she's made $1 billion very quickly from this tour. What's she going to do with it? That commentary was in the States. Again, Midnight Oil have $1 billion tour, which they should. They're very good, Joe. No one's going to say, what are they going to do with $1 billion? No one. So that's where we've got. I mean, again, I'm optimistic. I think the sector's going to grow rapidly. I think families are going to learn much. The incredible set. We haven't actually delved into the satisfaction side of it. It's incredibly satisfying to meet incredible CEOs in the for-purpose space who are who you'd never otherwise meet, who are having a crack at some, really wicked problems in our community, and some of the most amazing people you'll meet. So we just, as we share those stories better, families, as they think around, wow, look at our pile of wealth that's growing. We've got to get one of these foundation things. They sound great.
Mm. And you talk about the optimism of seeing these for-purpose businesses really making change and making a difference, and then also optimism around the next generation being maybe more motivated.
So
there's a very strong theme of hope.
Yeah.
And you talk about hope in the last part of your book.
Yeah.
And you talk about your dad as well. Could you perhaps give us a little bit?
Yeah. Look, let's throw some generalisations around about different generations, Joe. That's always fun, isn't it? I'm late 50s. My generation and the previous generation has been pretty good in Australia at creating wealth. I think the next generation is going to be more thoughtful around, and I see this. Well, that's great, Mum and Dad, but what are we going to do with this? We're worth 50 million. We've got 1 million in our foundation. When are we going to get serious about this? And thanks for creating all that wealth, but you're leaving us with a whole lot of problems to fix. And if we've got a foundation, we need to be having a crack at some of the serious issues. Mum and Dad, maybe that's a little bit less to art galleries and a bit more to issues like climate change in our First Nations Australians. So I think we'll be more thoughtful around, the next generation will be more thoughtful about how the wealth is going to be used and how much will be shared, and more consideration around, the priority areas of the foundation's giving. But I'm really optimistic. I think that its weight of money, families are sort of grappling with, well, how much is enough? Things we talked about during this chat, Joe, how much is enough? How much the kids need? Actually, let's do something creative with this. I'm really optimistic that the sector will grow rapidly in the next couple of decades.
Great news. I'm also thinking, as a sort of getting closer to the end, just thinking about how those that are listening can actually reflect on what questions they should ask themselves about how they're living their lives.
Yeah. Well, this American author Bill Perkins wrote a couple of years ago, life, and it's really interesting to reflect on. Life should not be about the acquisition of wealth. It should be about the acquisition of lifelong memories. And it's pretty hard to dispute that. And I'm sure someone could, but I haven't found a way to dispute it. That's what it's about. We create lifelong memories. We work hard, which provides us opportunities to do stuff. And one of the best ways to create lifelong memories with your family is through a family foundation. And I've got an old mate of mine. He's old. He's much older than me. Gareth Andrews. The older listeners will remember him. He played a bit of footy for Geelong and Richmond in the late 60s, early 1970s. Being a footy head, he's got a lot of mates, a lot of men who are mates, a lot of successful people. He loves to ask them, look, I know you've got a great family, you've built a business, you've sold it, you've got your fancy holiday house. Have you done your best work yet? Have you done your best work yet? And Gareth says, I usually go quiet and think, well, Gareth, I don't know. I don't think I have. I think there's more I can do. So, and, I've been reflecting on that, and that, again, is another reason for writing the book. I don't think that's my best work yet. I think that was useful work. I think my best work's the next decade ahead, trying to convince more and more families to think about a constructive use of their wealth, get their kids engaged, and have a lot of fun and satisfaction of doing that. So hopefully my best work's ahead, and I think it is for many people.
So at the end of all of our episodes, we ask a question of the guest, and sort of you're unprepared for it. Maybe you've listened to the previous episodes, I don't know, but I asked them, what is your spirit animal and why? And I'm pretty sure it won't be a squirrel if you're true to label. So
No, we don't want squirrels hoarding stuff. Let's get rid of it. We've got enough squirrels in Australia.
We do have a lot of squirrels.
let's exterminate the squirrels in a nice way.
In a nice way.
In a very nice way.
Yep.
Spirit animal, maybe an elephant.
Okay.
'Cause I think they're determined, loyal, and with a very long memory. So maybe it's a spirit. That's my spirit animal, the elephant.
So we discussed before as well that obviously I've been completing the special report, and
Well done.
yeah, it's been a little bit of a journey. I've been obviously reading your book, and there's so much amazing insight there. So I thought maybe we could make a little giveaway, and so we're going to give away copies of Peter's book, Give While You Live, to the first 10 people that email me at joe@itsneveraboutmoney.com.au and provide a suggestion for a copy of for a name for retitling the special report, which is currently titled Your Roadmap for Charitable Giving. So I'm going to keep it at that unless someone comes up with a better name, which is pretty easy to do. You can also download a copy of this report from the It's Never About Money resource section of the website on www.itsneveraboutmoney.com.au. So thank you so much for coming into the studio. It's been a delight, and I've learnt so much. And appreciate what you're doing just generally for the community.
Well, well done to you, Joe. Thank you for those kind words. But I love the fact that you're a wealth advisor and you're thinking about this space. Most don't, so you're ahead of the game. It's so well done to you and your podcast series. I've listened to a few of them. They're terrific.
Thanks a lot.
Well done. Thank you.
If you have resonated in any way with the sentiments of this podcast, we would be delighted to direct you to our website, www.itsneveraboutmoney.com.au, for more free resources and education aimed at improving your capacity to make sound financial decisions for the benefit of your family. We wish you every success, however you define it.